Okay, so I went and found the original video of the debate between Huemer and Sapolsky, and I guess I already watched the opening remarks on the Majesty of Reason channel, so I guess that's about 20 minutes in. We can probably skip. I want to see them discuss each other. So where does this come from? Percy Pryor. I don't know this channel, but that's very cool. So there's no timestamps. No timestamps. Well, that's all right. I don't put timestamps either. Let's see. Well, there's where he was doing the everything's argument to self-defeating. Okay, this is where we want to be here. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right into this now. I would like to hear the discussion between them. As I've been saying in my previous viewings and reactions to this, I've become more friendly to compatibilism over time. I haven't really seen them discussing. That's been a big theme of everyone's reaction, is that they're philosophers like compatibilism. But I sort of have been viewing Sapolsky as trying to give an argument against compatibilism, as well as in any form. Like, he thinks that he covers all the bases. And it seems like people think his argument doesn't do that. So I would like to understand. All right, so let's go ahead and see what's going to happen here.
Period. Each speaker will be allotted that much time for
the address there. All right, that's all.
Okay, and with that, we have Dr. Huemer's
insane and self-defeating is crazy.
statement in favor of the existence and significance of free will. We'll now move to a 5 to 7 minute rebuttal period. Each speaker will be allotted that much time for uninterrupted engagement with the opposition. That begins with Dr. Sapolsky. Dr. Sapolsky, you can now rebut Dr. Huemer for as many as 7 minutes.
Okay. Well, obviously, whatever I say should be taken with a grain of salt, since I am a madman. So I love being characterized as insane, so that's wonderful. And I certainly have the potential to be self-defeating in the next 7 minutes. It seems like there's a couple of threads that are running through Mike's thinking. The first one is an enormous emphasis on intuition. It wouldn't make sense, was one of the phrases. We feel that free will has to be true because it wouldn't make sense. We feel pride. We feel lame. We feel because of our belief system. And we see that we have just decided to point our finger at the strawberry ice cream instead of the chocolate ice cream because we have just made a decision intuitively that feels exactly like that. And I think one of the key things that the last 1,000 years have taught us is to be very, very suspicious of our intuitions. Let me give you an example. 800 years ago, if there was a hailstorm, people had a very solid intuition as to why a hailstorm came in the middle of the summer and destroyed their crops. It's because the old woman down the street there in that house is a witch. And the way you keep that from happening again is to burn her to death. 500 years ago, if somebody had an epileptic seizure, it made sense. It seemed intuitively obvious to everyone from a peasant to the king that this had happened because the person was demonically possessed. 50 years ago, if you had a child with schizophrenia and you took that child...
I see. So he's trying to draw a case against intuitive judgments. Because I agree that that's what I was emphasizing in the previous things, is that I thought Huemer's case was that it doesn't fit with how we theoretically, commonsensically, naively think of ourselves intuitively. So I think this is a good way to respond, is by showing that, yeah, we it just may be the case that is true anyway, which, so yay.
To the best experts in the universe and ask them why did they get this disease? There was an intuitively obvious answer, which is the one that dominated psychodynamic therapy for the first half of the century, which is you caused it. You were a horrible, hateful mother with ambivalent feelings about your child. You were a, quote, schizophrenogenic mother. And that seemed obvious, intuitively obvious. And 20 years ago, if you are a teacher and you see here's this third grader who simply is not learning how to read, and they keep reversing their letters and all of...
I'm going to speed it up because he keeps using examples to make the same point that we already got. But I get the point. Yes, very good.
That you've got an intuitively obvious one. They're lazy, they're not motivated, they're not trying very hard. And what these last 1,000 years, plus or minus a few millennia, have been about is learning that intuitionism is not often, or not always, the way to go. People figured out that hailstorms was due to some gravitational difference in Earth that caused a little ice age. People figured out that, oh, this person had a seizure not because they're sleeping with Satan, but because they've got screwed up potassium channels in one part of their brain. People learned that no, mothers do not cause schizophrenia in their children because they had ambivalent feelings of loving and hating them, and that produced toxic mothering. It's a neurogenetic developmental disorder that people are now working the details out. People have learned that kid who keeps reversing letters is not lazy. They've got some cortical malformations in one part of their brain, which we call dyslexia. What these last 1,000 years have been about is saying, yeah, it seems intuitively obvious that the sun rotates around Earth. And it seems intuitively obvious that the world is flat. And it seems
Yeah, I think I just kind of got the meaning of that Daniel Dennett phrase. If you make yourself small enough, you can externalize everything. Because, if maybe what he was meaning was that so he says in response, I am large, made of many subunits. I was struggling with that the other day when I was writing this. So it seems like Dennis' point then is, if you don't think of yourself as this whole thing, then if you think of yourself as something that's not responsible for anything, externalizing everything, well, where are you? What thing are you? You are this whole thing. I guess that's Dennis' kind of point, is that the person is disappearing here. And then it makes it easy to say you're not responsible for anything. Everything out there is responsible for it. Because all the things that were you are now out there. I think that's what Dennis' point was. I don't think I got it quite that way when I listened to it the first time.
Obvious that some people are so inferior to us that they deserve to be made slaves and kept in slavery for generations. And it seems intuitively obvious that women can't be trusted being allowed to vote. And intuition is a pretty scary litmus test for how things work. Because every time you sit down someone and you do a classic social psych experiment, you ask them, what's your favorite detergent? And it turns out, if in the room there's a picture of the ocean, the person becomes more likely to say Tide. Tide is my favorite detergent. And you say, oh, explain that to me rationally. And they will tell you why. And they will never have a clue that their intuition, that they decided in that moment that's their favorite whatever, that caused it. And this is not to say that that picture caused that behavior.
Yeah, so we already saw reason to be skeptical because of replication crisis. So I don't know how much weight to put on this point, but this is something determinists like to point out a lot, like the external factors. And then we confabulate reasons for why we think we did what we did. When clearly there's some other thing that explains it.
No single gene, no whatever, no, you can't say that because the janitorial staff didn't clear the trash out of somebody's office and it smelled terrible, and as a result he decided to invade Ukraine and slaughter 100,000 civilians. You can't say there's a genetic variant that made you break the law 34 times to pay off a porn star sort of thing. No single causal thing, but nonetheless collectively it shows you that intuition is not a very good guide for making sense of human behavior and the nature of the world, because it's been a pretty lousy one over and over. Maybe as a final point, another thing that Mike emphasized is what I see to be a frequent problem in people who attack hard incompatibilists, who say there's free will or whatever, which is the sense of that if you believe that that's how the world works, nothing can change. Everything is already predetermined. The philosopher John Searles has a hysterical way of framing it, that if I'm in the restaurant and the waiter comes over and says, what would you like for dinner? And he says, well, I'm a hard incompatibilist, so I'll just sit back and wait and see what my brain orders. I mean, that's in a sense sort of catching that tone. Predeterminism, there's no possibility of change. That ended with Puritans deciding that God decided whether or not they did something during winter and got a scarlet letter sewed on them or whatever. Lack of free will is completely compatible with change. And we understand the mechanistic bases by which a sea slug gets conditioned to retract its tail in response to a shock, and the mechanistic conditions by which somebody decides that a them who didn't used to be scary seems scary now. And under a fraction of a second, change happens with a final critical point.
I mean, this is something that B.F. Skinner and all those, he was a determinist. They like to emphasize as well. That once you know the full explanation of the behavior, it's sort of, you think you win somewhere because you enjoyed it or whatever, but really it's this long process of conditioning that explains why you chose this movie or dress in that way or something like that. So this is a pretty traditional determinism argument from determinists, that is to say.
Mike is absolutely right. We do not choose to change. We are changed, and we are changed in mechanistic ways that don't rely on free will.
Okay, now we can have a rebuttal from Dr. Huemer. You have 7 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so, I mean, I'm going to start by talking about Robert's opening statement. So it seemed to me like there's a type of argument. So there were several examples of ways in which human behavior is influenced by external factors. And so it looked to me like, well, there are two inferences that are questionable, right? So there's the inference from some influence to determination. Right? That is, so if you can list something that influences human behavior, or many things that influence human behavior, therefore human behavior is completely predetermined, right? Because I take it the determinist view is not just that things influence our behavior, but there's only one thing, okay? And then I just don't think that that's a cogent inference. And then the second thing that I thought was questionable is I would call sort of inference from the bad case to the good case, right? Because most of the examples of influence are cases where there's something going wrong, right? So like there's a person who has a psychiatric disorder. And then they do some weird thing that you're not supposed to do, or whatever, right? Or a milder case, but they're the judges who are less likely to grant parole if they're hungry. In fact, they haven't eaten recently. Okay, but what about cases where nothing is going wrong, right? So like it would seem to me that suggests that if you want the judges to make decisions properly based upon the evidence, you should make sure they're well fed before they make the decision. But but this doesn't show that nobody ever has free will, right? So how do you show that they're not making their decisions?
I guess what it was supposed to show is that the reasons that we take ourselves for acting aren't the reasons that we actually act. Since the person who's hungry by acting this way thinks they're being as impartial as when they're fed and acting that way. Right, wasn't that the point of the whole thing?
Really and in accordance with the reasons, even in the case where they're well fed, well rested, they don't have any psychiatric problems, and like everything is going well, right? Okay. And then I want to comment on, the long discussion about intuition. So first I want to say, like, the way we use intuition in epistemology is, it's not just any belief, right? Like, not just any belief is an intuition. So, like, several of the things that Robert mentioned, I don't think that we would call intuitions. The way we usually use it, or the way that I use it is,
Well, he meant intuitive, not intuition. So intuitive means things that you think are obvious based on, without too much thinking of it, whereas an intuition is like involving some kind of automatic response to a case or something like that.
It's a type of appearance, which is to say it's a type of mental state in which something appears to you to be the case or seems to you to be the case. And it's one that's intellectual and not inferential. Right? So intellectual as opposed to based on observation or memory or interest.
It seems that way. It could still be. But anyway.
Reflection is based upon thinking about sort of intellectual reflection. But it's not based on reasoning. Okay, like several of the things that Robert mentioned, they might have been based on reasoning. I'm not really sure. Okay, but the other thing I want to say...
So the difference is supposed to be like, someone tells you the Mary case and you have an immediate response. She's in a black and white room. She comes out, she's a tomato. Does she learn anything? And you go, yes. You don't have to reason about it too much. It just seems obvious to you right off the bat. So that's what he means by an appearance. And whereas these other things might have been more at the common sense level, like we think it's obvious that there are witches, but it's not clear that that's the same thing. He's taking intuition in that more technical sense of it being a reaction to a case as opposed to it merely being commonsensical. So maybe I was misinterpreting.
Okay. Why should we rely on appearances? Okay, why should we rely on intuitions? Well, the first thing is an intuition is a type of appearance, and I claim that all justification is based on appearances. So like if somebody says, oh, I don't like intuitions because here are some cases where somebody had false intuitions, that person is probably confused because they haven't thought about what their belief system is based on, including the thing they're saying right then. Right? Because there's no person whose beliefs are not based upon the way things seem to them. There's no, how else are you going to form beliefs? Now, it is logically possible to form beliefs on something other than appearances. Like you could form beliefs based on your desires, like what you want to believe. But nobody thinks that that's better, right? Okay, so like all of the examples of, why we don't have free will, those are all based on appearances. Okay, and furthermore, and it takes a while to make this case out thoroughly, but they're also all based on intuitions. They're based partly on sensory appearances, but they're all also partly going to be based on intuitions. Okay, so like, you have judgments like, oh, well, a person shouldn't be blamed for actions that are due to a brain malfunction. That's an intuition. So like, if you don't accept intuitions, then, why are you thinking that? Why do you think that's true? Right? And it's just like, at the most simple and basic level, well, logic is based on intuitions, like the laws of logic. So, if you don't accept intuitions, no reason to accept logic in general, right? You have intuitions like, free will is incompatible with...
So that's an important point, right? Whether you think the law of excluded middle, you have an immediate, visceral reaction. That can't be both A and also not A. So, Interesting. Okay.
Right, which Robert and I share, but there's a bunch of people out there known as compatibilists who reject that, right? And it's just going to be like, well, it's either
What did he say about compatibilism?
you have intuitions like, well, free will is incompatible with determinism, right? Which Robert and I share, but there's a bunch of people out there known as compatibilists who reject that.
Right, exactly. So they're aware of this, but they just don't care because they both reject it.
Right, and it's just going to be like, well, it's either that we have an intuition or we have an argument for that, but the argument is going to be based on intuitions. Okay, so it's just like you're just not going to have a coherent belief system without that. I guess then I'll just comment on the bit about determinism being compatible with change. So I didn't read that thing from Searle, which sounds kind of hilarious. But I don't think determinism means that nothing can ever change. But I think it means that things are either determined to change or they're determined not to change, and there's nothing we can do about it. So that does sort of seem to me like like a hopeless view. It's like whatever's going to happen is going to happen. We have no control over it, right? So, all right. I think that's all.
Okay, and that closes our
I found
rebuttal
that response
period. Now we'll move into a
confusing. Okay, let's
20 to 25-minute open discussion period, during which I will try not to intervene as the moderator and just allow the conversation to flow naturally. So the only reason I would come in, I guess, is if somebody starts reaching for the other person's neck.
If we're abusing each other.
Yes.
Okay, so let me go ahead and stop this and do a part 4 to the just open dialogue. Actually, I just want to listen to a little bit of this.
So as long as that doesn't happen, I think you guys can handle it. But maybe let's let Dr. Sapolsky start with his line of questioning, because that's been the pattern so far. Dr. Sapolsky.
Well, I think part of what we got here is what I realized I was terrified about this morning when I realized I couldn't sleep being nervous about this, which is we're obviously coming from totally different disciplines and different languages and stuff. Like in one of your writings, I have a quote: "Some people today worry that all of our choices are determined by microscopic events in our brains." And the tone was, yeah, right. And my response is, that's my entire universe. That's what people like I study. And I'm sure if I said something like, oh, well, that's just a philosophical question, you would have apoplexy at that point, saying like people have killed each other at conferences over like minutia about that. So we're in danger here of using very different languages, different orientations, with mine obviously being a mechanistic one and yours being a very different one. You bring up what I think is the toughest issue with like trying to make this argument, which is, oh my God, what if people actually started believing there was no free will? That blame and praise and punishment and reward and anything like that makes no sense whatsoever. How are we supposed to function? And my answer is, I haven't a clue. I have no idea, and it's hard as hell, but it will be morally much more in line with how the world works if we have a view that punishment, retribution for its own sake, never makes sense, and being nicer to one human than another one because in some way their actions have entitled them to be viewed more positively simply doesn't make sense. I don't know how we're supposed to live, and like I'm just sitting here saying this stuff. We've got some hints about some of the scariest things that people think would happen if we stop believing in free will actually won't happen. But just because God knows what the world is supposed to look like doesn't change how things work.
Yeah. Well, so that's an interesting question. Like, if we reject free will, do we have to stop punishing people? Now, one of my flippant responses is no, because like we're just going to do what we're determined to do. So,
of course, that's a flippant response. No, we're just going to do what we're determined to do. You can see him smiling. Look at that smile. But the question is, does it make sense to punish? Or is there such a thing as punishment because someone deserves it, retribution? Now, there might be other reasons to punish. But if everyone stopped believing that people deserved retribution, what would be the case? I think that's kind of Sapolsky's point here. So punishment for the reason of retribution, not he kind of defines punishment as that and then says punishment. So it seems like you could misconstrue what he's saying. But
now, one of my flippant responses is no, because like we're just going to do what we're determined to do. So, if we keep punishing people, that will just mean that we were determined to punish people, and we can't be criticized for that because it's not our fault. Even if we know that it's not the criminal's fault, but we still punish them anyway. That's not our fault. So, okay, but we will be making a mistake. I think most determinists would say, well, it's not exactly that you can't punish people. It's that you shouldn't. It's that you would get rid of the retributive rationale for punishment, but there can still be a deterrence rationale. All right, so we'll continue to punish people just to make them stop doing it. And now I have an example that's supposed to show that this isn't good reasoning. All right, so imagine that there's a crime that's been committed, which is high profile. A lot of people are outraged about it. Okay, and the government can't find the person who actually did it. But what they can do is they can find an ex-con who was recently released, and they can say that he did it and frame him and then punish him. Okay, and they have no evidence that that person actually did it. Okay, but he has done bad things before. So, okay, and so would that be a good thing to do? Okay, now without a retributive rationale, that's equally good as punishing the actual criminal. Right? Because first of all, it will deter people because you'll convince the public that that's the person who did it. So they will now see people person who they think committed a crime getting punished, they'll be deterred. Also, this person, the reason why he's an ex-convict is that ex-convicts are at risk of recidivism, just like the person who actually committed the crime. Right? This person is also at risk of committing a crime in the future. So the incapacitation rationale also applies equally well, right? But most people's reaction is no, you cannot do that, right? Oh, wait, sorry, I think you're muted.
Yeah.
I agree. I hope people shouldn't do that. Because, at first glance, that's this sort of utilitarian argument, like screw up this one person and nonetheless you accomplish the societal good of making crime less likely and people.
Yeah, but exactly. So it's a consequentialist argument, which I think Huemer is using here as an argument against the idea that we can get rid of retributive justice. Like that, we just have this intuitive assessment of this case as by the way, I don't really think I agree with this thing that it all boils down to intuitions, but I don't want to get distracted by that. Anyway, okay, so yeah, let me hear what
justice served or whatever. And what I understand to be a problem where people say, oh my God, utilitarian. If you think that way, you're going to wind up just grabbing somebody and throwing them in jail just because people will feel better and they're totally innocent in this scenario. But you have to have a deep utilitarianism, which says, okay, so we now have a sort of society where you can take an innocent person and jail them as follows. And is that for the common good? Yeah. And maybe we should have a sort of society where we take a healthy person and euthanize them because their organs will save this many people's lives. That's a good utility. And somewhere along there, the slippery slope issue, when you look at the implications, the trouble with most circumstances where it seems like, oh, well, this appalling utilitarian conclusion makes sense is because you're looking through a narrow time window. When you make stark decisions like that, you need to see what the long-term consequences are, because what you usually conclude from that is, no, actually, it's not for everyone's good that we're able to get away with throwing innocent people in jail just because somebody will think justice was done. So I have some issues with that.
Like what, rule utilitarianism, or he said deep utilitarianism? So he's just agreeing that, yes, you want to become a utilitarian, but then you want to somehow make sure that you have a kind of utilitarianism that says that it's wrong to do this to the innocent person. I guess Huemer's example, the guy wasn't innocent. He was innocent of this crime, but not innocent generally speaking. So because it's not good in the long run to punish people for the crimes they didn't commit, first of all, I don't buy this deterrence argument, so that's a whole separate thing. But okay.
Oh yeah, so I'm not sure if I was completely clear on why I was giving that example. It's supposed to show that you need retributivism, right? So most people will have the reaction that it's okay to punish the person who actually did it, but not the ex-convict who didn't do it, and so that can only be explained by the.
But of course, he's just saying no. You're going to have a type of consequentialism that gets the same result if you can have it. I don't know exactly how it would go, but so that you can get rid of retributivism and still say you shouldn't do this.
Retributivist rationale. And then, so you suggested, well, maybe there's like a more long-term consequentialist reasoning. Like if we do this in general, maybe, eventually it will cause lack of confidence in the justice system or something. Imagine that this is just one person deciding to do this on one occasion, right? And nobody's going to find out. And then, still seems wrong. Right now, I am, of course, relying on intuition here. But, you tell me how else you're going to make moral judgments, other than your intuitions.
Well, taking a historical view, you just said, okay, you need to be retributive, but you don't actually have to be. 500 years ago, we were trying to figure out why the water in the well suddenly became contaminated, and we had an interpretation that involved retribution. The lepers did it, so let's burn them at the stake, and this was like a usual judicial sort of route there. Or someone had a seizure, and we needed to punish them for having slept with Satan, and retribution is appropriate there. And at some point, people said, oh, no, it's a neurological disease. Oh, toxic mothering wasn't the cause of this person's schizophrenia. Oh, this kid isn't lazy that they can't learn to read. Over and over, what we've done is subtract responsibility subtract retribution, subtract judgment in the form of blame and resulting punishment, we have learned to subtract those things out. And not only hasn't the roof caved in, because we no longer believe that people with epilepsy are demonically possessed, not only hasn't the roof caved in, we have made for a more humane world. The notion of responsibility is a stake on which lots and lots of people have been burned.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, like, those are examples of, false factual judgments, right? So, like, I wouldn't, so, like, burning people at the stake because they're witches, like, I would describe the error there. The error there is not believing in retribution. Like, if somebody actually got supernatural powers by intercourse with Satan, then I guess they should be punished. The error there was the factual belief that actually happened, that this happened. Right? And by the way, if the factual belief was true, then yeah, maybe society would have collapsed because there'd be all these satanic witches going around or whatever. But anyway, like my argument
So
isn't.
that's a good point, though. What he's saying is we didn't get rid of the idea of retribution, but I think Sapolsky's point of, I don't know, he does go off these non sequiturs. It's hard to see what his argument is. So we got rid of the notion that we needed to treat these as acts that involving retribution because we came to believe something new about the case. So Sapolsky might generalize and say, we'll do the same with respect to these kinds of cases. I'm really not a hard determinist, I don't think, but or hard indeterminist, which is probably what he is, but or hard incompatibilist, sorry. But it's not seeming to be, so if you generalize from this case, then do you get an adequate argument against Huemer? Hold on.
Actually happened. That just happened. Right? And by the way, if the factual belief was true, then yeah, maybe society would have collapsed because there'd be all these satanic witches going around or whatever.
But so he didn't address what I thought he did. Okay, so if we then come to have this factually erroneous error in these other cases like alcoholism or anything, actually, adultery, etc., and we say, oh, we were wrong to think that this is really, they're failing in some way or doing something wrong in the same analogical way as sleeping with Satan or whatever the case was with witches, then we're going to say we don't need to, put them away or get retribution. Will anything negative happen, bad? Sapolsky's arguing, no, in cases where this actually did happen, it got better. So I think there is something to what he's saying here. I don't really think Huemer's addressing it.
Anyway, like my argument isn't intended to be consequentialist, right? That is, I'm counting on you to just have an intuitive reaction in this case that, no, you can't punish this person who didn't do it, right? And it's not because society...
Right, and he does have that intuitive reaction, and he thinks you can get a utilitarian account of it.
It's just like it's unjust to that person. And then if you have that reaction, then you think, okay, but why do I think it's okay to punish the person who actually did it? And then it's going to have to be because he deserves it or something, right? So, I mean, all the examples that you gave, it was fine to stop being retributive.
No, it's going to be because he's the cause of it.
Of things that people actually had no control over. But if we stop being retributive about, the things that I would say we have control over, that would be worse.
Except again, with a historical view, go back 500 years and you got somebody who's as liberal as both of us probably are, and you get somebody there who's thoughtful and introspective, and they probably belonged to NPR at the time and had a little NPR tote bag in their Hamlet or whatever, a sensible, reflective person. And it simply would have seemed like we cannot have a functioning society if we don't get rid of these witches who have these seizures that prove that that's who they are. Over and over, in a sense, the history of scientific insights about behavior has consisted of people saying, oh, I had no idea that had something to do with it. And we've gone from the world of you really need to subtract out retribution when thinking about people having epileptic seizures, they're not witches, to you're pissed off because the person sitting at the table next to you in the restaurant is chewing with their mouth open and making loud sounds. And you say, I want to strangle them. Somebody to say, and no, think about their fetal life and all these things that, we're obviously in a different realm of trying to make sense of this stuff and what retribution can you ask this person to leave the restaurant or even burn them at the stake. But at any given point, the sense of, oh my God, how are things supposed to work if we subtract out retribution? And if we subtract out praise and reward, this seems unthinkable, unimaginable. And people 500 years from now will view us as just as absurd as the peasants who thought the seizures were caused by Satan and be just as appalled at the decisions that we make.
Well,
But will
so
they still be talking about retribution and have a sense of justice and right and wrong that is related to people deserving things and getting what they deserve or escaping what they deserve? Yeah, they may look back on us and still, that was kind of Huemer's point, I take it, is that, yeah, we look back on them and go, oh, you don't punish them for that, but we still want to blame you for these other things, like willful murder and so forth, for fun. So it's not clear that in 500 years that will be gone, although if everyone believes in determinism, then it will. Okay.
I mean, it's sounding to me like a sort of skeptical induction. Like people have had a lot of false beliefs in the past, and so we're probably wrong today. But that can't be right. Like that's too broad a brush, right? So people were wrong about a lot of things in the past. So, but that doesn't mean that we should just like reject any belief that we have today, and we can't do that because because then what is our policy going to be based on? Like, well, we like at any given time, you just have to go on the basis of your best guess as to how the world works, right? What's the alternative? And so, and okay, and like, the mistakes that people made in the past. Okay, it would be a good induction if the mistakes people made in the past like implied or were implied by some belief that people still have today, and then you could say there's evidence against that. What I think is not good is just sort of like generalizing. Like the only similarity is this seems obvious to us today, and that thing seemed obvious in the previous century. That's not enough of a similarity, I think.
But that's not the only similarity. It seemed obvious to them. They thought getting rid of it, like not blaming them, would be bad. We sort of re-understood it in a biological way. We don't blame them anymore for that. People having seizures are not thought of as communicating with demons amongst the mainstream. So, but nothing bad happened. So it's more than just that, right? It's more than just that.
To undermine the current belief. You see what I mean? Like if that works, that undermines everything, like every belief that we have, right?
Well, that generates, I think, what is ultimately a moral issue, an ethical issue. If you know that the judgments you are making today about who counts as an us and who counts as a them, about who should be allowed, sanctuary in your country coming from those people are different from us. These are all decisions. If you are, I think by now, morally obliged not to fall into, well, I mean, that's how we know the world works at this point. We know how aspects of the world work. We know a lot of the science. And you bring up, I think, a great counter argument where you said, just because you can show that this has an influence, it doesn't mean that influences like that explain everything. If I'm paraphrasing you correctly.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's, Sartre used to say that, they're influences, but they don't cause you. But they can influence you, sure. Lots of well-known points. Okay, let's see here. So let's go ahead and I'm going to have to do another part to this. Okay, so I think I can power through for one more, but then we'll have to put this on hold. I do want to get to this, see where they go with